Hi, my name is Bruce Lee Clark, and this is my co-moderator, Sean Marie Oler. And we want to welcome you here to this evening to Bennington Tonight, produced by Mike Bethel, who gives his, he's sorry that he can't be with us, but the weather just doesn't make it easy for him to travel. We welcome you here for this candidate forum for candidates for Bennington County State's Attorney. We also want to thank the two candidates who you will hear a great deal from during tonight's forum. And we also want to thank this evening's underwriters, C.L. White's Glass on Gage Street, Hawkins House on North Street, and Bennington Mill Properties on Benmont Avenue, all here in Bennington. I also want to thank the town of Bennington for their use of this facility, and also for GNAT-TV, who's recording tonight's forum and who will broadcast it prior to the election.
So, even though Bruce had just gone over some of the preliminaries, we were not actually being recorded. So we have a few preliminaries to get out of the way, including to give you all a sense of how the evening will proceed. The candidates, have they drawn?
Yes.
So do we know who's going first?
Yes,
Okay.
Erica's going first.
So the candidates have drawn to see who will go first. Each will introduce themselves. Bruce and I will ask questions of both candidates, and they will have a chance to answer. We will then open up the floor to your questions in order to facilitate that process. Please write the questions on the cards that you see around, and as Bruce said, you may include your name or if you wish, but you do not have to. We want to address as many issues as possible in the approximate 90 minutes that we have, and this will be replayed for the full 90 minutes.
Yes. At approximately 8:15 to 8:20, we're going to end the questioning and then move to final statements. Each candidate will then give up to a closing statement. We'll divide up the time remaining. Again, thanks for coming. And don't forget that on this Thursday evening, same time, same place, the candidates for Bennington County Sheriff will be participating in a forum as well. And we hope that you'll come back for that. Okay. So
who drew number one?
Erica drew number one, so she gets to go first.
First, I would like to thank everyone for being here. Particular thanks to Mike Bethel, who's the organizer of the forum, and Bruce Lee Clark and Sean Marie Oler for acting as moderators tonight. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Erica Marthage. I'm the Bennington County State's Attorney, and I have been the State's Attorney since 2007. I have lived in Bennington County since I was about 10. Now, some of those folks in the audience that know me probably don't know a lot about my personal history. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. I grew up poor in Manchester, which was a significant challenge. My father was a severe alcoholic and had a very difficult time keeping a job. We lived in a seasonal camp. We were homeless for a period of time when I was in middle school. And then even when we did have an apartment, there were a lot of frequent financial issues. My parents regularly were choosing between food and the electric bill. So needless to say, we ate a lot of venison and trout because that's what my father could catch and kill. So I don't eat those now. My parents, my mom was a chambermaid. She worked also as a waitress and a seamstress. They did not graduate high school. My mother got her GED sometime after I was born. So I was not someone who ever dreamed of going to law school or having any kind of big achievements. I knew I wanted to live a better life than how I grew up. It wasn't always clear that that would be the situation. In school, I struggled significantly with truancy, fighting, general behavioral problems, which of course is something that we see a lot of today in similar situations to how I was living. I missed 63 days of the 6th grade. I just found an old report card in my attic and was pretty surprised that that was my attendance in the 6th grade. That also, parenthetically, was the year we were homeless. I've been asked what turned it around for me, and the simple answer is I have no idea. There were a number of people that were supportive. There were people that reminded me of what I could do. There were people that reminded me of what I didn't want to be. So at some point, I decided I'm going to go to college because my friends are going to college. I went to college on and off for several years. I had to work the whole time, so there were periods where I couldn't afford to be in school and pay my rent. Ultimately, I ended up going to the University of Vermont because it was cheap. I went to the University of Connecticut Law School, which is a very good law school, but also offers in-state tuition to individuals that are Vermont residents because we don't have a state-funded law school. I graduated law school in 2.5 years and immediately returned to Vermont because that's where I knew I wanted to live and be in the community. Now, my background's important because it informs everything that I do in my job. It always has. I've worked in prosecution since 2000. I left in 2005 and ran for the office in 2006. Ultimately winning the election and being sworn in 2007. Since then, I've worked hard in this county to make Bennington County a better place. Now, prosecution is not a static job. Everyone knows that. Community values change. Over time, things change. When I was a deputy, first deputy, it was illegal to have even a small amount of marijuana. And we had regularly had cases based on that. And now it is, as you all know, legal to possess misdemeanor amounts of marijuana. All areas of prosecution have changed, and all of our community values have changed. My office has evolved significantly over the last 12 years. There are a number of alternative justice programs where we can direct members of our community that have made some poor choices and help put them back on the right path, also while protecting our community from violent individuals. I've lived in the same house for the last 18 years. I'm the first and only person in my family to own a home in Manchester. I'm also the only person to go to law school, from what I can tell, for generations. My family typically are in the trades, and they're almost all carpenters or have married carpenters. So I broke the mold when I married a lawyer. Kids are, I have 3 kids. My daughter Katie is in 6th grade, my son Ted is in 4th grade, and my daughter Maddie is in 2nd grade. My 2 youngest kids attend school at Manchester Elementary, which is the same school I attended. And my husband Brian is a local attorney here in Bennington. We both volunteer our time and our financial resources to support a number of local organizations. We're part of the fabric of this community. We love living here. My past, my present, and my future are all here in Bennington County. And again, I wanted to thank you for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
I'm Cristina Rainville. I'm a real prosecutor with real accomplishments and a real plan to end the opioid crisis. I was the Chief Deputy State's Attorney for 8.5 years. During that time, I handled all of the most difficult cases. I took a case for Bennington County to the United States Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and won. I handled 25 jury trials. I handled 25 appeals before the Vermont Supreme Court. And I was the person in times of crisis. When a child went missing under very worrisome circumstances, I was the one the state police called. I was the one who dropped everything and ran out my front door and raced to get to the emergency command center that the state police were setting up in Manchester. I was the one who asked them to issue what turned out to be Vermont's very first Amber Alert. I was the one who stayed there through the night, working side by side with the detectives from all over the state, doing everything and anything that I could to support their work. And I was the one that when we got the call from the New Hampshire police that the Amber Alert that I had requested had worked, I was the one who stayed on and then drafted all the legal papers that New Hampshire required to bring the child back to Vermont. I was also the go-to person in Bennington County for dealing with the legislature. I drafted and helped to draft multiple bills that became laws. I'm most proud of my work protecting children. One of the laws that I worked to draft greatly increased the protections for children, and when the governor decided to sign it, he came to Bennington County and honored me. I was the one he honored at a public bill signing ceremony. So people ask, why am I coming back now to run? And it's one word: opioids. We all know the devastating impact that opioids are having on our community. I have a plan. I have a 21-point plan, which is on that table over there, along with my brochure. I don't have time to talk about all the 21 points right now, but I'm going to talk about 2. First, we need a drug court. We've needed a drug court for years. Rutland has a drug court. Chittenden has a drug court. I will set up a drug court my first day in office. My drug court will treat these cases like the emergencies that they are. Time is of the essence. In my drug court, every defendant who's arrested will be seen by the judge within 7 days and offered treatment. And all of the cases will be put on a schedule to be finished in 6 months. We need to get the dealers off the streets. We need to get people into treatment. And letting these cases languish on the dockets for years is having a devastating impact on our community. The next area of my focus in my 21-point plan is working with the medical professionals to reduce the number of opioid pills that are legally prescribed in our community. Study after study has documented that there's a direct correlation to the sheer number of pills that are legally prescribed in a community to all of the problems that happen in the community, including babies born addicted to heroin. To opioids. Vermont has one of the highest rates in the nation of babies born addicted. Kindergarten class of 2019, it's going to be 5 out of 100 across Vermont, babies born addicted. This has to be a huge focus for us, is to work with the medical community. And I have one idea that's a no-brainer that costs nothing, and that's at the top of my plan. We need to give our medical prescribers access, free and immediate access to Vermont's criminal conviction database, so that before they write a prescription for someone who's requesting opioids, they can check and see this person has a conviction for selling opioid pills, and consider that as a factor in their determination whether to write a prescription. If they don't have access to that now, I will work with the legislature to make that happen. We also need to make sure that the medical providers are given all the resources that they need to immediately refer people to treatment, because we know, and the studies show, and the anecdotal stories tell us, that when you cut off an opioid prescription, many of those people will turn to heroin. This is an essential time to get people into treatment, so I want to work with our medical community and make sure that they have those resources and that we can make that happen. We need to be constantly aware of the new challenges. For example, the FDA announced 2 weeks ago that there's now an epidemic of people intentionally hurting their animals and bringing them to veterinarians to get opioid pills from veterinarians. So we need to stay on top of what's happening. Part of my plan is to work with veterinarians to make sure that they know of this risk, to make sure if they suspect it, that they report the potential cases of animal abuse, and that they also have the resources so that when they refuse to give a prescription to someone, they can get them into treatment right away. So my history and my plan are all part of the same thing. I'm always here for Bennington County, and I will be here for Bennington County to bring change.
Just one other additional thing which I forgot to read, and I thought you'd all want to know this. When Mike Bethel asked Sean Marie and I to moderate this, we talked together about what would be the purpose of the forum, just so that we're all in on the same thing, and so far we've been doing that. It's really this evening, and I hope your questions come in, will allow the candidates to communicate to you and to the greater public regarding their vision for the position for which they are the state's attorney for Bennington County. This is a forum and not a debate. That's a really important concept. This is a forum, so they get to talk to you. That's what we're looking for. Okay? So when you're shaping your questions, and I hope that you will, that's what those purple cards are for, or blue ones on the table. Please make sure that you shape them in a way that we can ask both candidates. Okay? And they knew about it. They've gotten that information before, and now this would work. So Sean Marie, you have a question, and then we will get to questions that we received, and hopefully you can just pass them up.
Did you hear any of that? Okay,
Sorry.
it was off.
Oh, shoot.
So I have the first question, and it goes to both of you, but you pretty much answered it in both of your opening statements. And the first question is, what qualities or abilities do you possess that make you uniquely qualified for the position of the Bennington County State's Attorney?
Do you want to add? Let's start with Erica and then go over to Christina and add to what you've said if you have.
So I would add to that. I think some of the important qualities that I possess for a state's attorney are I have a really extensive list of partnerships with local, state, community agencies, community partners, other state agencies, law enforcement. I've built those relationships. I am well respected by those individuals, and I've been able to represent the county at both a local and a state level for that. A couple of the other things, I'm very actively involved in the community, and that's an important part because it's impossible to know the community values and how the community wants to see our community justice system run if you're not part of the community and engaged actively in the community. The things that work in Burlington or some other county may not work in Bennington, and I can certainly speak to that from a number of years of dealing with that. I think it's also important to have an innate sense of fairness and justice. I think truthfulness and common sense are both important qualities, and empathy and compassion, I think, are also filters that are really important. I think you also need a really thick skin, because I can tell you over the last 12 years I have been treated not so great on a number of occasions, and you just have to take it as I'm the face of the criminal justice system, and when people are frustrated they express that to me, and it's not personal even though it frequently feels that way.
Thank you. Christina?
The state's attorney's office is above all a practicing law office. There are charges that need to be reviewed and compared to the statutes to see if it fits within a crime or not. There are motions that need to be done, there's briefs that need to be done, depositions that need to be taken, appeals that need to be drafted, and judgment calls based on having trial experience and appellate experience. The state's attorney needs to lead the lawyers in the office. And to do that, you need to have extensive appellate experience. I've tried 25 appeals. You need to have extensive jury trial experience. I've done 25 jury trials. And you need to know what's going to work with the jury, what's not going to work with the jury. There's constant judgment calls, the Supreme Court issues an opinion and changes the law to make sure that the deputies know that the law has now changed. There's a constant amount of legal work that has to happen. And I did that through the entire 8.5 years that I was the chief deputy. And I think that makes me uniquely qualified for this position because I'm the one with the trial experience. I'm the one with the appellate experience. I'm the one who, when the laws don't work, go to the legislature and get them changed. Did that on multiple occasions. And that's an essential function of the state's attorney's office. It's a practicing law office. You need a practicing lawyer running it with the experience to train and mentor and check and make sure that all the lawyers in the office are doing things professionally, completely, and appropriately.
Thank you. Just again, a reminder. And
You don't need to, she kind of answered it already.
okay, well, okay. Then I'm going to go to a different area completely.
Can I just ask, are you going to switch up the order as to who goes first?
I can.
I mean, I don't know if it matters, but I just was just
I don't
wondering.
know that it matters either, but why don't we try this just for fun?
Okay.
Okay? So you're both going to get the same question, and you're both going to have roughly the same amount of time.
And we
So-
have our timers going.
Oh, yeah, we've been keeping track. God bless cell phones. As you know, and as we know, the United States incarcerates people at rates higher than nearly any other country in the world, and Vermont is certainly a part of that trend. In recent times, there have been discussions about how to reduce the number of the incarcerated in Vermont, considering we are now moving more than 200 prisoners to a privately run prison in Mississippi. What do you see as the role of the state's attorney, and particularly the role of the state's attorney from Bennington County, in this issue about incarceration? And what sorts of data do you think the state should be collecting in order to maintain accountability from all within the criminal justice system for any changes that we might want? But so it's really a two-part question. What's the role of the state's attorney? And secondly, what kinds of data should the state be tracking in order to determine, are we incarcerating too many of our fellow Vermonters? Or maybe you could want to reject that whole notion in the first place, but go ahead.
It's a complicated issue. I understand that Bennington does have among the highest rates in the state of incarceration. I tried the most heinous violent crimes, and I feel confident that the sentences that those defendants got from the judges were appropriate. But I do think that there are several areas that we need to address and need to start looking at differently. And this is part of my 21-point plan. It's a fact that someone who has a felony conviction will have a difficult time for the rest of their lives getting employment. It's a fact that if you don't have employment, many people get depressed, some people may turn to drugs. It's a fact if you can't get employment that you may turn to be a drug dealer or may turn into a robber to get food on your table. So we have to look at convictions very carefully. And there's a long history in this office, and Ms. Marthage used to say, make him take a felony so he can't work again. And when I heard that, I was very, very upset. The idea that we're having, and I met an 18-year-old man in Bennington a couple weeks ago who got a felony conviction at 18 for marijuana. He had a scholarship to college. He lost his scholarship, never went to college. We need to look at these issues very carefully. So my first step would be to work to immediately expunge all marijuana convictions that are no longer a crime today. It's the right thing to do, and we can get those people back into the employment market. The next thing we need to look at is, are we locking up people for addiction in victimless crimes, just for possession? Shouldn't that money be better spent by having these people go to treatment? And a part of my plan would also be to work with the court and the defense bar so that if someone has a victimless opioid conviction on their record, they can work their way out of it by maintaining long-term sobriety with checks and balances, and to get these people back into their employment and opportunities. This is essential. And I think that if we look at the felony convictions that have been given over the years, that a lot of them do not serve our community long-term, especially when we're talking about 18, 19, 20-year-olds. We need to look at that very carefully and look at other options. So that's a part of my plan.
Thank you.
Erica.
So what Ms. Rainville just said isn't true. And I am entitled to say that, even though this was not supposed to be what we were talking about. The Bennington County, as of July 2018, had 43 individuals serving sentences. Nearly every one of those was for a case where it was a felony crime of violence, where they either physically or sexually assaulted another individual that was seriously injured by their actions, or for dealing drugs for profit. Not one of those people that's incarcerated is in there for a misdemeanor, and not one is in there because they are a drug addict. I don't support sending individuals that are incarcerated to private jails outside of Vermont. I don't. We don't have the room in this state, and the tax money that it takes to build new prisons within state is just not there. However, I think that there are a lot of alternative programs. Bennington County was one of the, Windham County started a pilot project that involved home confinement and home detention. They did not have enough people participating in that program. I volunteered to refer people to be on that GPS monitoring system. Those were the people that the court and the police looked at and said, the sheriff's department who monitored them and said, this is a person that does not need to be incarcerated, either pending sentencing or pending their charge, their case. So to me, the role of the state's attorney is looking at what the charge is, what the proper charge would be. When we're talking about 18, 19-year-olds with felonies, I've already testified repeatedly over the last 12 years on youthful offender status, expungement, and how we can better use those tools and use our justice system to actually help give people second chances and help people get back on their feet. So someone that has I have done multiple expungements over the last 12 years where I actually completed and filed the paperwork on behalf of defendants that I had convicted because I felt like they had been able to demonstrate that they had made a significant change in their life. Do I think that people should be banned from working for the rest of their life because they have a felony conviction? Absolutely not. I think that the newest legislation that I just reviewed yesterday is going to be a proposal that involves the court being able to look at essentially all felony offenses for drugs and determining whether that person has turned their life around and has been rehabilitated and has not been in any trouble for 10 years. So the role of the state's attorney, I think, is important. I think the information we need to be looking at is why is the person in jail, not just sheer numbers, because we're not at the highest level of incarceration rate.
Thank you. So this question is again on sort of a similar topic, and the topic is drugs, and the county and the state and Bennington County have been experiencing the use of opiates and other controlled substances. What do you think will need, what do you...
This is for Erica, sorry.
Right. What steps do you think you will need to be taking in the next 4 years in order to address the situation?
I'm sorry, repeat the first part, the opiate?
So the county and the state and Bennington County, the country, the state and Bennington County have been experiencing the use of opiates and other controlled substances. Right. What do you think you will need to what will you think you'll need to do in order to address the situation in the next 4 years?
So as I indicated earlier, it's been a gradual, things have been changing over certainly the last 5 years in the criminal justice part of our system, but also how we look at drug crimes. So the most important prongs of dealing with the opiate addiction crisis is going to be prevention. We need to be getting at this problem well before it starts. It's going to involve treatment, making sure that people do have access to treatment. I started in Bennington the treatment diversion, which is so they tried having a drug court many years ago, before I was state's attorney, and the legislation that allowed for that cut the funding to it. That's a decision made by our legislators. They decided they were going to cut funding to that. It's a huge nut to spend on people like me and a judge and a courtroom to sit and meet with people who really need to be sitting and meeting with caseworkers and treatment providers and support people that are helping them get jobs and get housing and get treatment and remain in recovery. And that's not the role, your money should not be spent on just another person like me to sit in another courtroom with another judge spending the day talking to addicts. How we decided to address it, and we did this very kind of unofficially because I frankly got sick and tired of waiting around for someone to give the official okay on it. We started working with the Center for Restorative Justice. They are essentially the clearinghouse for treatment and recovery in this community. They send people to places like UCS, Turning Point, Valley Vista, different residential placements. They are the ones that sit down and do a basic screening. They connect people with more in-depth screening agencies to see if they in fact do need residential treatment. That's the place we should be putting our money and putting our time, and we've been doing that on no money. The Center for Restorative Justice was doing it just as part of their daily operation. Last year, the Attorney General allocated some money to what the Attorney General calls it the Tamarack Program. We were already doing it here. We just called it treatment diversion, so we've continued to call it treatment diversion. Just now the Center for Restorative Justice gets some money to do that. So that would be the way to address the treatment and recovery. And interdiction is a very important fourth prong for interdiction, treatment, recovery, and prevention. We need to make Bennington County an awful place to deal drugs. We don't want to make this a cushy, nice environment to come here and deal drugs for a profit. We want to protect the people that are here that are not addicted to drugs yet, and we want to help those that are our community members that have fallen to this horrible addiction and have really had their lives spin out of control. And I think continuing our work with treatment diversion, I've had some interesting conversations lately with some local agencies and groups that are looking at a treatment. It's similar to a drug court. They're looking at drug court models. I've already indicated that I would be in favor of something similar to that, but let's not do the court part. Let's have it be an organization of people, of the conference, whatever you want to call it, the panel, the group of support people. It's kind of like when you do social work and you have a group of people that are doing wraparound services, so you have multiple people that are helping this individual achieve their goals and holding them accountable, and then they report to us, this person is doing great or not doing great. Not have us sit there and pay us an additional salary, an additional courtroom to have people sit there and talk when we're not the ones that are helping them.
Okay, number one, we need a drug court, because these people who are dealing are not allowed to be held because selling drugs is not, under the Vermont Supreme Court rule, a crime of violence. So most of them, unless they're a flight risk, are back out on the street the day after they're arrested. We need to get these cases done within 6 months so that the dealers are off the street for good. Number two, we need an inpatient treatment facility in Bennington County. We don't have one, and that's shocking. Number three, we need a recovery housing center in Bennington County. Medicaid used to pay for 28 days of inpatient treatment. They now pay for 14. So every time someone has the courage to go to inpatient treatment, they're generally kicked out after 2 weeks. And there's no place for them to go. Most of them are homeless. So they go back to the very drug dens that they worked so hard to leave, sleeping on the same couches, and the cycle repeats again and again and again. Recovery housing will allow them, and Turning Point has a whole plan for this in Bennington, will allow them to live in an environment that has controls, checks, balances, support, mental health support, and under the plan that Ken is working on, also to have vocational rehab, Vermont Vocational Rehab, have an office in that facility to give job training and job support. If we had a recovery center like that, it would pay for itself, because it would stop this 2 week in, 2 week out cycle. And the stories of how many times it takes people to complete this 2 week cycle till they reach recovery are horrifying. Recovery housing will give us a much better option. Number four, I think I'm on, or three, I've lost count. The state's attorney's office has a plethora of information. That information needs to be made available to the community. The first baby born addicted to heroin was about 10 years ago. That was the time for the call to arms. The community should have known that that happened, and you can do it without any identifying information. A child was born addicted to heroin. The training in the schools should have started at that point. We should have started a public awareness campaign so that at-risk women could learn about the resources that are available for long-term birth control like IUDs that does not require regular maintenance that an addict cannot maintain, like a daily pill. The legislature last year made those services free, which is fantastic. We need a public awareness campaign to let these women know that this is available for free. Here's where you can go get it. Every overdose, every death, every baby born addicted is an educational opportunity for our community. We shouldn't hear in 2018 that the state had the highest rate in the nation, or one of the highest rates in the nation, 4 years earlier in 2014, of babies born addicted. And we shouldn't have heard that from the Center for Disease Control in Washington, D.C. It should come from the state's attorney's office. When I'm state's attorney, I will work very hard with all of the educators in our community to make sure that they have the information available so that they can make whatever education decisions they think are appropriate. I will work very hard to make sure that parents have access to that information. This is a new time. At what age do we need to educate our children what a heroin packet looks like? Because they're going to start appearing in schools. I met a woman this weekend whose 2-year-old picked up an empty but powdery heroin packet in Willow Park. This is a crisis that needs a leader to educate the community, to keep the community current on what's happening so that everyone can educate themselves and educate their loved ones. This is all part of my 21-point plan, which I urge you to read. There are copies over there on the table. I have it on my website, CristinaRainville.com. We need an all-encompassing approach, and these are some of the pieces that I think are just absolutely essential.
Thank you. We have a couple questions from the audience, and this question I think it has to do with inmates also going to Mississippi, which I think you answered a little bit. So this is going to go to both of you. Do you envision someone who will be reviewing cases of people who may have been over-sentenced?
Is that to me? Okay.
Yes.
I would be happy as state's attorney to review anyone who wants to have their sentence reconsidered to come in the office and meet with me and to discuss it. I can't say in advance without knowing the facts what the decision would be, but it would certainly be something I would be open to consideration. I represented a woman who was involved in a murder. I won the American Bar Association's highest honor for my pro bono work in that case. She was involved in a murder at age 19. She's now been there 30 years. She's had an exemplary time in prison. She graduated with a 4.0, got a bachelor's degree from Boston University through a Massachusetts program. There are people who, even in the worst cases, have found redemption, have turned their lives around, and I would always be willing to consider something like that. And in terms, I didn't get to express my view on, the question didn't come to me. I think it's an outrage that we send Vermont prisoners out of Vermont. And I think we need to tell the horror stories to the press, to the legislature. It's going to cost money, absolutely. But a lot of these people come back very damaged, and it's not the right thing to do to send someone so far that their families can't visit them. How do we expect them to recover if they can't have the ongoing support of their families in prison? That's an essential part to keep the contacts with families and friends when you're in jail. It needs to stop, and I will work as state's attorney. It may not be possible, it may be an overwhelming challenge, but I will work as state's attorney to make sure that Vermont prisoners stay in Vermont.
Thank you. Do you want me to repeat it?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I actually have been meeting with people for the last 12 years. I meet with defendants, with victims, with defendants' families. I receive regularly, after people are sentenced, I regularly receive mail and phone calls, and I do review those and look at them. The state's attorney, of course, does have some limit to her authority in the world. someone that's convicted and sentenced, the state's attorney does not have the authority to just pop their head in and say, I want to change all of this, because we are not the ones that sentence people. A court does that. And so, but I have had an open door policy for the last 12 years, and I will meet with anyone, sometimes much to the chagrin of my staff. But I truly feel like I had a judge many years ago say to me, the most important thing that you're going to do is to make sure everyone involved in the system, no matter what their role, feels like they've been hurt. And I have always abided by that. So the answer to, I indicated before, I don't agree with, I don't support sending individuals that are incarcerated to private jails outside of Vermont. I don't, again, the state's attorney has no authority to say, to tell the Department of Corrections where they can send people. We can testify about things that we know about, but if I have someone that has murdered someone, which we have, under sentence out of Vermont, out of this county, I don't have the ability to require that the Department of Corrections house that person within the state of Vermont. I do believe that there are a number of other solutions to folks that are incarcerated outside of Vermont. I think if we're looking at a combination of approaches, which would be utilizing some various housing, house arrest, home confinement sentences for some individuals involving closer supervision by the Department of Corrections, and moving around some of the populations within Vermont. There is, if anybody's been keeping up on it, has been some conversation statewide about a new prison. So, you know, if it's anything like the new state hospital, we'll end up with fewer beds than what we started with. So hopefully that works out better.
Part of the question which you actually answered, and this really doesn't go to either of you, it's just more for clarification, but I think one of the questions was, who decides who goes out of state? And it sounds like from what you just said, it's the Department of Corrections. So whoever asked that question, the answer is the Department of Corrections decides who gets sent out of state. So just as an FYI.
Okay. Okay, this for both of you. Can you talk about systemic, this is from the audience, systemic biases that seem to be part of our current criminal justice system? You can talk about race, gender, any number of those things, but this is an opportunity to address what you think about the systemic biases in the system.
So it's harder for me to speak to, obviously, race. I'm a white, middle-aged woman. I can say that when I'm making charging decisions, I never consider race. For the most part, we don't know the color of the person's skin when we get the paperwork. As a matter of fact, within the last few years, they added that field in our computer system and started requiring us to keep that information. Before, we never even used to get it, and I wouldn't know until I actually showed up in court, at which time the charging decisions have already been made. What I can speak to is poverty, and it is definitely, I think, the criminal justice system from attorneys up, not law enforcement, attorneys up, are mainly comprised of educated, upper class, suburban, whatever kind of background that just does not understand the place from which the people we work. We see people that don't have a place to live. The kids aren't going to school because they don't know where they're sleeping that night. So for us to try to impose our middle class values on the people that we're dealing with is something that I struggle with regularly, and I just have to put a plug in at this point. I just read this book called Hillbilly Elegy, and I absolutely loved it because I have spent my whole life thinking, I really don't belong here. So when I went from poor kid in Manchester to homeowner in a public office, people didn't know me as who I was before, but I sat there thinking, how did I get here? And I'm not one of you people. Like, they would talk about things that I never felt like part of that culture. And this book, this person just talked about the fact that, he went to Yale Law School on a full scholarship, and he was, part of a Kentucky hillbilly family. And he said, you just never lose those roots that you come from. And so I think when we're looking at systemic bias, I think in a state like Vermont, I think there certainly is work to be done on the bias question. I'm on the training council at the Training Academy, Police Academy, for the Fair and Impartial Policing Act that they've been working on. And I think that there is certainly work that can be done in that area, but the people that I know and that I work with are not making decisions based on the color of someone's skin or their gender.
Thank you.
I haven't gone into my background, but I'm going to say this. My father was abandoned by his parents and placed in an orphanage when he was a toddler. He was horrifically abused. He ran away from the orphanage at age 7, and he happened to live in California where he could live on the beach in Santa Monica. There were no employment laws for children. He had a job before school, after school. And he completely supported himself from age 7 in abject poverty, with one pair of pants, no underwear, no parental supervision, and he managed to do exceptionally well because he got into the ROTC program by a test. I understand poverty. I understand child trauma. It's always been a focus of my life. Now, what would I do about racial disparity and racial bias? We need to recognize in a community that's over 98% white that it's inherent in just about everybody because we don't live their lives. And we need to focus on that. So, and I've put a lot of thought into this. What would I do as state's attorney? Number one, I'm going to keep statistics of the sentences that we recommend for white people versus black people and make sure they're the same. And if I have a situation where someone who's had 20 grams of cocaine, all the white people got X number of months or years, and all of a sudden the judge out of the blue has a black defendant and he's giving him 10 years or whatever it is, it's not fair, I can say to the judge, Your Honor, this is what my statistics show for the sentences for white people. I think what you're about to sentence, and in fact I would do that at every sentencing, and that this is what it should be for this defendant based on past sentences. Most important, we need to recognize that a lot of our police officers are young and inexperienced, and the key role that the state's attorney can play is educating and training. I don't think that we're a community full of racists, but we need to focus on perception and what we do. So for example, whatever someone's views are, I would train the officers to learn that just being accused of racial bias, racial profiling, driving while black, can destroy an officer's career. So you better be careful not to do it and think about it cognitively. I attended a federal trial last year, and it started by a car with 3 young black people driving on Route 7 at the speed limit in the left-hand lane. And the officer from Bennington testified that he pulled people over all the time for driving the speed limit in the left-hand lane on 7. I've driven that thousands of times. I end up in the left lane, I forget to go back, I drive over the speed limit. No one's ever stopped me. So I'm really curious about that. If that were my officer, I would be talking to him and saying, let's look at your records. Did you really stop white people? People might make an issue of this. How are we going to address this? It should come up, it should be reviewed. Now that when I was there, we didn't know the race of the person, we just had paper. But now that we can know it, to look at every single stop and say, would this person have been stopped if he was a white person? And to think about it and to meet with the officers and talk about it. It's all about training, and that's what the state's attorney's office needs to do. That's what I would do as state's attorney.
Thank you. So these two questions come from the audience, and I'm going to ask them together. So one of them is, how does mental illness factor into the work of the SA's office? And would you consider, along with the drug court, a mental health court similar to Chittenden County? I don't know what a mental health court is.
The mental health system in Vermont is a disaster. And these people who are severely mentally ill do not belong in the criminal justice system. And a lot of them end up there because there are no other options for them. And we need to definitely address that as a state. We need to have, there's some ridiculous, as Ms. Marthage mentioned, some ridiculously low number of beds in the Vermont State Mental Health Hospital for our entire state. We've had situations again and again of there being no beds available, so people are chained to an emergency bed in a hallway in an ER in a mental health crisis. This is completely unacceptable, and I think the way to do this is to make is to give it publicity, so the people who vote in Vermont understand what a crisis this is, and the legislature will start funding it. And I hope we can do that before there's some horrific crime that happens. But it's a part, unfortunately, every day of the state's attorney's office. And then you have the problem of this person committed a crime. It's a crime of violence, for example, often is. What do you do with that person? Well, they land up in the criminal justice system where they shouldn't be, but the state's attorney's office has very little options. You can't say, well, this person's mentally ill, so I'm not going to handle them in this system when no one else is handling them either. We need to really work on a combined system with the Department of Mental Health.
Thank you.
So I think the first part of that question was, what is the role of the state's attorney with the mental health system? So the state's attorney takes, we file all of the guardianships that get filed in family court for individuals that are developmentally delayed or otherwise unable to care for themselves and do not have a family member that can step up for them. So part of what my role is, because I handle this docket entirely myself, is that people in the community just come in. They'll come in and say, my mom has dementia and can't take care of herself and won't let me help her with her bills. I help those people file the petitions. The state is the moving party. Lately, I've filed a number of petitions in probate court for guardianships for just elderly people that don't necessarily have a mental illness but cannot make decisions for themselves. The court at that point will look at whether there's a private guardian or a public guardian that can assist that person. People that commit crimes in our state that we know are mentally ill. An example is a few years ago, a man that was selling garbage in one of the parking lots in downtown Bennington. The police called me repeatedly about this individual, not because he was some kind of significant public danger, because he was not wearing appropriate clothing and it was below zero. He had some serious issues with one of his feet and had to be admitted to the hospital. He would not go there voluntarily. So he was taken there by the police and ultimately admitted. He was not competent for, it was disturbing the pedestrian flow of traffic. That was what I had to actually file in court so I could say that this person needed to be treated at the hospital. Is that an ideal system? No, definitely not. The resources in our state are very limited. I still get letters from a number of people that I've worked with through CRT at UCS. They work with folks that have developmental disabilities that are trying to have jobs and be able to work in our community, and they are individuals that sometimes have a harder time getting services and getting housing. So the role of the state's attorney really is, I had a question from a probate judge saying, well, why are you filing this? Here's the short answer, because nobody else was doing anything about it. I had a woman, an elderly woman, that would not turn her heat on in her house because she believed PFOAs were going to asphyxiate her if she did. I had the police in Manchester go to her house. She had snow inside of her home. And I had her taken to the hospital, and I filed a guardianship for her to get a public guardian. And that was the question I got in court. Why are you here doing this? Because I am allowed to under the statute, and nobody else has done anything about it. So it really, the State's Attorney's Office can be a complete catch-all for kind of all of those unusual situations that need to be addressed.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one of the questions, not from the audience, that we had written down, and it's around juvenile justice. And what trends do you see in the area of juveniles and their encounters with the criminal justice system? What steps are you willing to take in order to reduce the number of juveniles in our system? And what would the state's attorney's response in order to, what would you consider in order to respond to reduce the possibility of recidivism?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm first, right? I love this topic. So I started as a juvenile prosecutor. I love juvenile court. What I've seen over the last 12 years, about 12 years ago, in this county, we started using a youth assessment screening tool. We were one of the first counties in the state to do it. It was an assessment that either a DCF worker or Center for Restorative Justice goes through. They get an initial sense of whether this child or juvenile is coming up on, and these were only for delinquencies, and that would mean they're over 10 and they committed what would be chargeable crime. They're assessed for low, moderate, or high risk. And we don't know what the specific questions are or where their areas of risk are, but it's things like school attendance, home life, mental illness in the family, substance abuse in the family. And then the person makes a recommendation for whether that person needs to be involved in more social services, assistance with maybe living situation, maybe it's an issue with their parents that need treatment or some other type of help with housing, or they can just go to the Center for Restorative Justice. And so that seemed to be working okay for a number of years, but then I started getting some cases that involved like snowball fights that had ice or rocks in the snowballs. And so 12-year-olds throwing snowballs at each other and hitting each other with rocks. Well, you're 12, I've been there. We lived in low-income housing for a while, and that was like the only thing that we did after school was something where somebody was getting hurt. So, but is that something that somebody needed to be in court for? No. So we worked with the Center for Restorative Justice, and last year we were so lucky, Letha was able to secure a significant anonymous donation to formally begin a pre-charge program. We had informally been doing it because CRJ was so great and they would just take people even though they weren't formally on our caseload, and the Bennington Police Department were great because they would send people like the snowball or the mailbox vandalism or whatever it is and have people go address the issues with CRJ. So that's been a significant addition. We have multiple cases being referred to that. That means they're never involved in the criminal justice system, which is great too. We've had some interest in different clubs through CRJ, which I think is also a really great way. And we just started this. I've been on the Truancy Project for the last 10 years, and I've been on juvenile justice for 20 years. The Truancy Project deals with trying to catch kids that are, school attendance is intricately linked to delinquencies. So if you have a kid who's not going to school, it's more likely that they're going to be someone who's then committing delinquencies. So, but trying to figure out why they're not going to school could be anything. Again, it could be transportation or housing or whatever. So poverty or bullying or some other issue. So we started having these truancy days where the court, my office, the defense attorneys, and the school come to court and individually sit down with each kid and try to figure out why they're having a problem with school attendance, and we try to address those needs before they actually officially are spending time in our justice system. I've also testified a lot about youthful offender and the expansion of juvenile jurisdiction favorably with that, because I think that a lot of the kids that we're seeing then become young adults that are 20 that shouldn't be in programming with 35-year-old felons. They should be in a programming that's appropriate for a 20-year-old, so.
Thank you.
I think based on my time in juvenile court in the 8.5 years I was in the office, I would send many more cases to the Center for Restorative Justice. I think a lot of the cases that I saw are not worth dragging a kid in court, not worth the trauma of that experience, not having the kid miss school and the parents miss work, that it should have, we can do a lot more cases. To me, a bigger issue though is charging children as adults, or charging very young adults, someone who's 18. And as one example, I read recently an appeal from the Bennington office of an 18-year-old who was charged as an adult with sexual assault for consensual sex with a 14-year-old. He was convicted. So he's going to be a lifelong registered sex offender with a felony sex offense that's going to make him unemployable for the rest of his life. He'll never be able to have a job with children. The list goes on and on and on. I think we need to look very, very carefully at that age when we're doing cases and see, well, now I don't know when that case was brought and if it could have been done as a juvenile or not, but these are the kinds of cases that we need to be looking at closely. A lot of cases, people 16, 17, should not be charged as adults, and that was happening an awful lot when I was in the office. The laws have changed somewhat, but that would be a focus of mine, to make sure that we put a lot of thought into how is this going to affect this child to come into court, how is it going to affect this child to have this conviction, what are we doing? That would be my approach.
Thank you. Are you going to ask some audience questions?
Yeah.
Wait, am I on?
Now we are. Technologically challenged. I apologize. These two sort of go together, and you can tell that there are issues in at least this audience about the drug situation. So, really two parts. One, have either of you ever sat down with someone who has been addicted to drugs to find out why they were addicted and what made them go to drugs, so that you can perhaps help them find out why people are doing the drugs, and that way you can try different ways to help them and ask them what helped make them change, so if they had changed. That's sort of on the one sort of personal one-to-one kind of thing. Secondly, the use of Narcan in the community, and its availability. There's a question about, is it available? If it's used a lot, or if it's used by the same person, with the same person over and over and over again. Is there some thoughts about how to address that continuing sort of exigent need? Okay, so those sort of are two sort of related but not related drug questions. And Cristina, you went last, so you're here. You're up.
I actually, the last couple months, have been going door to door throughout Bennington County and meeting and talking to people, and I've spoken to a large number of addicts, I've spoken to a large number of recovered addicts, and I have a good sense. And what the theme that came up with them mostly when I asked about what changes they wanted to see in the state's attorney's office was they wanted to be treated like human beings. They wanted to be treated like they had a heart, like they had a soul, like they had a family, that this is addiction. And I thought that really meant a lot to me to hear that. in terms of the use of Narcan, people complain to me now that there are Narcan parties where their neighbors have a party and they all bring Narcan so that they can get as high as they want without worry. And people are complaining about Narcan parties happening next door in the apartment next door. I mean, that's a serious issue, and no one wants to live next door to that. No one wants that on their block. And people told me about people passed out, unconscious, waiting for the Narcan to arrive across the street on the front lawn. But on the other hand, Narcan saves lives. So we need to recognize that this is a disease. Imagine if alcohol caused deaths like this. We would give them as many chances as possible. So I don't see a purpose in reducing the availability of Narcan. I think it should be available widespread, and there also should be specialized training on it. I learned in a training last week that Narcan lasts 60 minutes, but the high from opioids lasts 90 minutes. So if you give Narcan in the first 60 and you leave, the person can still die. I mean, there's facts like this that I think the community needs to know. But if someone is if the ER or the police are repeatedly using Narcan for a specific individual, I think that should be addressed. It needs to be addressed by the legislature. There needs to be a law or provision that if someone has repeatedly been revived with Narcan, and I don't know what that is. I would want to meet with the community and find out what people think. One possibility would be you make it a misdemeanor so you can at least get them into court and require them to go to treatment. That might be the best answer. But yeah, we need to do a lot of things, and that's a great point.
So I talk to addicts and their families all the time. I have worked with a number of parents of adult children that have come to me because they are at the end of their rope. They call me, they stop me, they call me at home and tell me about the path that their child has taken, their 25, 26-year-old, stealing from them and stealing from others and lying, and they've never wanted to report them because they don't want the police to be involved. They want to do this on their own. Most of my largest supporters over the years have been the parents and families of addicts that I have helped through the system. Sometimes it does require going to jail because they don't want to go to treatment, even if it's court-ordered. And I have a new friend, I would call him a friend, who I've known for a lot of years, that I knew through my job, that I just happened to come into contact with a few months ago. He was someone that had gone to jail. I had sent him to jail. And he reconnected with me and has been sober 7, almost 8 years. And he's doing great things for the community. And I could not be prouder. But asking him that was the first thing I asked him. What did it? What did it for you? I knew you from the time you were a kid. He had a couple of responses to that, but it's a lot of, you can say that there were a couple of things that made him from a kid who just got into a lot of trouble like I did to a kid that was addicted to heroin. He could point to a couple of factors, and he could point to some supports that got him out of that, but having those conversations with all of those individuals are the most satisfying part of my job. The parents that called me during the beginning of this election season, that I had one man that I've known my whole life, we've only shaken hands a couple of times, called me at home and told me that I saved his family. And I was shocked. I'm not comfortable with emotion. So that was hard to hear, but I just loved having that conversation. So the Narcan question, what I would do to change the Narcan situation right now would just be that when Narcan is deployed by police officers or EMTs or at the hospital, that then there be some follow-up as to helping them get services. I've repeatedly told, publicly have done PSAs about it, it is important to have Narcan available because I'm the one that is sitting in the room with folks when they lose their adult child to drug addiction. I've sat with multiple parents who have lost their kids, and every single time it's heart-wrenching and difficult. And so if it saves someone's life, then we need to be doing it. But I think we could be doing it better.
Thanks.
So we have a couple questions from the audience that, well, I'm going to say we have decided not to ask because they have to do with what I would consider personnel issues, and I just don't think, so I just wanted the person who sent it up to understand that we are not going to ask things that people wouldn't be able to necessarily respond to.
I think being able for us to be able to know these things, we all have to be able to ask these questions in these things.
And I would agree with you, so I would say that it's incumbent upon you to ask those questions not in this forum, but personally, you certainly are free to ask. I understand, but
We need to be able to ask these questions because there's people here sitting here looking like, they got things to ask also. I'm pretty sure, we all talk about the opioid crisis, but there's other things going on in this town, okay? There's a lot of things going on in this town, all right? And I heard you talk about how this is a white town, right? How this is most of it is white, right? But there's a lot of black kids that go to these schools and live in this town, okay? So for you to sit there and say that, this is a white town, whatever, no, that's not acceptable, okay?
I totally agree with that. If that was the impression I got, I apologize.
That's what I got from you. There's a lot of issues, okay, that's going on in this town, and we're talking about one thing, okay? We need to talk about all the things that's going on. The racial issue is a problem in this town for people that don't understand, okay? All right? My kid comes home and talks about how kid calls and says niggers every day in schools, okay? You walk into the school, there's no black history in the schools, okay? Not one. That's ridiculous, okay? To keep that out, that has to be taught to all the kids, okay? So I'm a little bit disappointed by what you just said, okay?
I understand. I understand that you're.
These questions is not sugarcoat anything. Let's get it out here.
I understand, and I'm going
I
to.
don't care about this 21 part. I don't care about it.
Excuse me.
Let's talk about other things.
Hey, let me ask a question for you. What can you do about the race situation if there is one in Bennington County? Is there anything you two can do to address it?
But we did ask that question.
If there is one.
So what I would do, and I think that private lawsuits are a great way throughout our history to advance civil rights. What I would do is I would invite you to bring whoever you want to come and talk to me and meet with me and hear from you about your concerns and what.
Also overseen a lot of cases. Okay, because you just sat there and said that Erica said to throw this person in jail. You suggested that defense cases were not allowed for people to defend themselves. You said that. So if that stuff is going on, right, for 11 years, you said it. If that stuff was going on.
People were absolutely allowed to defend cases.
You allowed it to happen, okay? So you win it too. Right? It ain't just Erica, okay? Because you were working, because she gave you the position, and you didn't use it right. Because I got a woman right here, sitting right here, that got a situation going on, that she has a lot of questions also. Because her loved ones is locked away. Okay?
What I would do is I would invite you to come in and bring anyone you want to bring and to listen to your concerns, and you can educate me and tell me what you think I could do differently. I have done that already and met with people in the community who are not white, specifically to address this issue. I think it's an incredibly important issue. I would also look at it in terms of juvenile court, because it seemed to me sometimes in juvenile court that black males were expelled from schools for things that white males were not. You know, those kinds of things I think that we need to look at and examine and make it stop.
But you sat up here the whole time talking about
Sir.
and having that other stuff in.
So-
Yes, yeah, I'm sorry, sir, but we did ask that question. We did ask those questions, and
She said that everything.
I know.
So we allowed to say whatever.
So,
No?
one
This
of,
county's about to disclose, tell me,
I-
because we want to know.
one of the
We
things,
want to know why she left.
Sir?
Did she leave or did she get fired?
Sir,
well, and that was the question I chose not to ask. And so I apologize, because I don't think it's fair for Erica, and I'm not siding with either one, to talk about a personnel issue in public. I mean,
Listen, well, and that's true, I totally understand, but again, we just want to be able to meet with our politicians. Which we're going to start doing.
yep, and I was going to encourage you to do just that.
I'm going to shut up, thank you.
If you want to meet with me, go to my Facebook page, and I'll be happy to meet with you
that's
anytime and place.
not in person.
Okay, let's,
So I have this one, we have two last questions, and then they're going to split the time left. And it's around, the last pre-done question is around collaboration. And given the needs in Bennington County, what organizations and systems would the state's attorney be engaged with in order to do the job successfully? So I don't know whose turn it is.
yes, it's Erica's.
Oh, I thought.
No, actually, I think it's Christina's.
To do the job of the state's attorney, you have to be involved with basically every organization in the county. I think that would include, I mean, if you're talking about opioids and mental health, that's UCS, Turning Point, people who are organizing treatment, building a treatment center, recovery center. You need to work with the legislature. You need to work with the police. You need to come up with uniform plans and training about what are we going to be doing about whatever issues come up. We need to meet with minority groups to find out whether we're serving their needs and whether they feel like their needs are being served or not. We need to just meet with everyone on a regular basis. And an important piece also is there are a lot of towns other than Manchester and Bennington. And I met with the police chief in Winhall and learned, for example, that it's very difficult for them when there's a mental health crisis because they don't have a screener in Winhall. And it's basically a 45-minute, 50-minute drive to Bennington Hospital, and they have very few officers. I mean, we need to find out with all of our community what the problems are and work to address all the problems. There are a lot of problems. We're not doing a lot of things perfectly. I'm focused on the opioid crisis because I think it's a huge problem in our community, but there are other huge problems. I agree.
Okay, thank you.
I think all other state agencies, I'm on a number of them, as I mentioned earlier, the Criminal Justice Training Council, the Domestic Violence Task Force, I've been on a number of the governor's appointed positions for opiate addiction. I think it's important for the state's attorney to have working relationships with the actual people. It's easy to say, I'm going to have this relationship with the Department of Corrections or the Department of Mental Health or the Department of Public Safety. It's something very different when I can turn around and call the Department of Children and Families on the weekend because some issue has come up that I think would be better solved by just having a conversation with the caseworker instead of going through a lengthier case involving the court. And those types of relationships, and that's the beauty of like this small community. And Bennington County is a small community. We all, a lot of us have been doing this a long time, and we've made connections and built trust between our agencies. The hospital, the Center for Restorative Justice, all of the schools, law enforcement is an important, and I have to say, the state attorney's office is not in charge of the police. So the select board's in charge of the Bennington police, and the Manchester select board's in charge of the Manchester police. Department of Public Safety is in charge of VSP. We have to work hard, and trust me, I was the only female state attorney when I was elected in '07. It was a lot of hard work to get a room full of senior law enforcement to have a conversation with me about things I think they could be doing better. But those are the kinds of relationships that, it's not a dictatorship. State's attorney does not have that kind of authority. We're not ruler of the free world. We have to have the conversations with the other agencies and try to make things happen, and I think that it's great when it's happening from a grassroots point of view.
Great, thank you. Last question. And I'm going to ask that in order for you to give yourselves enough time for closings, that you try to be as brief as you can, though this is a really important question, so I feel badly about that. This is a question from the audience. And both of you have spoken about programs that you would like to institute or changes that you would like to make, whether it's a drug court or a treatment center or any number of other incentives. If you could speak briefly to what you think the costs of your proposals are and who's going to pay for them. So both of you have made proposals, so I'm interested in this question. Okay? I think you're up.
Mine will cost nothing, because at this point, we need to, I've been on board from the beginning. I've been working closely with Turning Point and the hospital, and I'm one of the first advocates for sober living in this community. Those are all parts of that system that are going to cost money. More residential treatment in our community, emergency beds for mental health so that people in mental health crisis are not sleeping in the emergency room for 5 or 6 days. What doesn't cost money is the community effort that we can make as the organizations all have conversations with each other and have conversations with each other. I had a meeting last week with some individuals that one of the individuals I was extremely hesitant to meet with, but after we kind of finished our conversation, there were definitely some common themes that were coming out of the conversations that we were having, and progress that I think can be made that wouldn't necessarily result in paying another judge and paying a bunch more overhead for an actual court system, so we can actually put that money into treatment and recovery housing where it should be.
Thank you. Cristina.
Okay, so my giving medical professionals access to the criminal justice database would cost nothing. It's there, it exists. All they have to do is have login information. My education and awareness campaigns would cost nothing. The drug court would also cost nothing the way I envision it, which is that it's the regular court, same judge, same building, same lawyers. We just set aside every Thursday, or whatever the needs are for that court. How many cases are on that week? Maybe it's a morning, maybe it's Thursday. We just handle the same cases, but in a different order, giving those the highest priority. What will cost money is getting a drug treatment center in Bennington County and getting recovery housing in Bennington County. I don't know the costs. I know Ken has a huge plan to put together, and he's working on getting funding, but I think that part of the state's attorney's role is to lobby the legislature to understand the need that this money needs, and the governor, this money needs to come to Bennington for this purpose.
Thank you. Okay, so earlier in the evening, we had a draw, and Cristina, I believe you are up first for closings. How much time do you think you're?
5 minutes?
5 minutes?
Yeah.
If we can hold for, both sides gets 5 minutes, please don't get up and walk out.
At 8:30.
At 8:30.
So give us 4 more minutes.
Give us 4 more minutes to make that happen. Okay, I'll try to give you the high side in case you don't.
Okay, I'll try to talk fast.
Okay, go.
I'm running on my record and my experience, and I've explained why I think it's incredibly important that the state's attorney have experience. I handled a case for the U.S. Supreme Court. Ms. Marthage did not do any of that work. I handled 25 jury trials. When I was in the state's attorney's office, she tried few or none. I don't even remember. I handled 25 appeals before the Vermont Supreme Court. There's not a single Vermont Supreme Court opinion that indicates that she argued it. She talks about juvenile court and how it's her passion. There is one Vermont Supreme Court case that addresses her work in juvenile court. It's a truancy case. I handled the appeal. Truancy cases are insanely simple. All you have to do is have a witness with the school records to say the kid was absent all these days. She tried a truancy case without that evidence. The Supreme Court struck the case down and said that the evidence that she had was insufficient. It's really concerning that the head of the office would have a trial for truancy and all the days that you bring that child out of school to be in court, and not present evidence of how many days the kid was out of school. I handled that appeal. She asked me to do it. In terms of the opioid crisis, in 2015, there was a big movement in the county. A lot of organizations got together. They scheduled a meeting. They wanted the state's attorney to be there. They invited her to be there. I was in the office at the time. The meeting happened. She didn't go. It was reported in 2018 that the same thing happened. There was a big meeting scheduled and she didn't go. It was reported. I don't know about that firsthand, but it was in the paper. I do know from personal experience, though, that when I was doing the Amber Alert in Manchester, she was home in Manchester 10 minutes away and never came to the Emergency Command Center for Vermont's first Amber Alert. And in terms of the opioid crisis, I was in the office for 11 years while nothing happened. No public awareness, no changes, no policy suggestions, nothing. And then in April of this year, Ms. Marthage wrote an article for the Vermont Digger. This is April 2018, where she said, I want this article to serve as a call to action. 10 years too late. It's now September, and despite her call to action, she still doesn't have a single change for the state's attorney's office. What she does in this article is she says that they need to begin thinking about how to spend new federal money, which is passing the buck. It's like it's not the state's attorney's office problem. Nothing in the state's attorney's office is affecting this. The fact is that we can look up and down our streets and see that what the state's attorney's office has been doing is not working. We need a change, and that's the purpose of my plan. I've put together a 21-point plan, extensive research, extensive networking and speaking to people in the community. I'll implement it on the first day. It's the first step. There will be more after that. I have always been there for Bennington County. I was there for 8.5 years handling the toughest cases, showing up for emergencies, whatever was needed of me. That's the kind of state's attorney that I will be. I will always be there for Bennington County. I will do what's best interest of Bennington County, and I'll listen and hear to everyone in Bennington County. No matter where you are, what you are, how angry you are, my office will be open to have conversations and to listen, because I need to learn and I need to hear criticism so I can get better. That's always been my lifelong strategy. So I will be a state's attorney for change, beginning on day one, affecting the opioid crisis. And I will work to change other problems as they arise in the community and make them better.
So I'm going to start with that I should be a re-elected state's attorney because I'm doing a great job for Bennington County. The criminal justice system, as I indicated earlier, is undergoing a significant reform. I've made sure that Bennington County has a voice in that reform. I've been a leader in developing and implementing restorative justice programs in the state of Vermont while still protecting our community and those individuals that want to do us harm. I have had the honor of serving on multiple boards and committees, both in Bennington County and Montpelier. In that capacity, I've been able to make sure Bennington County is not forgotten and is, in fact, a pioneer in new approaches. I've built important relationships with all of the organizations I've already discussed. In cooperation with community partners, I helped create treatment, diversion, and the juvenile pre-charge program. I am dedicated to Bennington County. I've lived here for most of my life. I go to school here, I work here, raising my family here, volunteer here. I live this job, and anybody that knows me knows that. I have been on call 24 hours a day for the last 12 years. There are few police officers that you will talk to that will say they could not get a hold of me. Now, much of the facts that you just heard have been twisted and manipulated, as is the case with Ms. Rainville. And there were multiple Supreme Court cases, many of which were returned for her presentation offering manipulated facts and twisted law. So my position as state's attorney has always been that compassion is part of that job. I have worked hard for all 12 years and met with people and understood their backgrounds and their families. I spend a lot of time talking with victims' families and their friends. I have dealt with the entire spectrum of cases from every facet of what the office does. I have been consulted from multiple other offices in the state, have called me in to review their cases, to help them streamline their office. The job of state's attorney is administrator. It is to hire good quality attorneys and good quality staff. I've done that. I've weeded out the ones that I do not think belong there or do not fulfill that obligation that I have to the community, and I expect that I will continue to be able to do that. I enforce the laws that are enacted by our legislature in a manner that's consistent with our community values. Do we want Narcan parties on our street? No, but do we want our neighbors' kids dying of an overdose because they're going to shoot heroin anyway? No, we don't want that either. I think that my understanding of Vermont's criminal justice system is innate. I've been here, I've been involved in it, I've been involved in all aspects of it. I've lost 2 of my nephews while they were on supervision with the Department of Corrections. I get it. I've been sitting on the other side. And to me, it's important that the person doing that job understand it. I review all the drug cases. I'm the one that sends them to treatment. I'm the one that takes the phone calls from the upset parents in the middle of the night because they know me and they know they can call me at home. So I would ask that you look at someone who's balanced, someone that has integrity, someone that has a high level of dedication, and someone that can work with compassion and empathy, because that's the most important part of what the state's attorney does.
Thank you. I just want to, before we all go, want to thank both of you for coming, and for all of you for being here. I also want to make sure that we remember that this is an episode of Bennington Tonight, and that we thank our underwriters, C.L. White's Glass, Hawkins House, and Bennington Mill Properties. And thank you, and good night. Don't forget that sheriffs are here, the sheriff candidates are here on Thursday.
Thank you.